So this session is what to know about accessibility if you work in a library. Let me show these captions now. There we go. The reason that we developed this session was we sent out a survey to our 200 plus member libraries this fall, asking them what NC Live could do to better support them in their accessibility needs and interests. We asked a lot of questions related to e-resources and training, and we found that on the whole, a lot of our member libraries don't necessarily have a requirement to attend any sort of accessibility training. What we also found when we asked for their preferences in a list of topics, web accessibility and accessibility 101 were the most requested. And so based on that feedback, we organized and put together this session and wanted to make it responsive to the needs of our member libraries. And hopefully for folks joining us outside of North Carolina, this is helpful to you too. So today I am joined by Eva Earles, the reference and instruction librarian at Carteret Community College, and AlTonya Washington, who is the head of reference at Winston-Salem State University. They are both members of our training advisory committee at NC Live. And so working with them and some other committee members, we kind of decided to build out and actually figure out, okay, what would an intro to accessibility training look like? What are certain things that we really should cover? And what you'll find today is the first half of the session, the first 45 minutes, will be more of a presentation format. And then the second half will be breakout rooms that each of us will lead. And those will be more deep dives into specific skill sets. And so I'll have them introduce themselves as well now.
Hi there. Like she said, I'm Eva Earles and the reference instruction librarian at Carteret Community College. I haven't had a whole lot of formal training in accessibility, just a webinar here and there. But of course I do, I am responsible for accessibility with the materials that I do produce, as is everybody. And I am on the accessibility committee here at the college.
Hey everybody, I'm AlTonya Washington and I am the head of reference at C.G. O'Kelly Library at Winston-Salem State University. And again, like Eva, I haven't had a whole lot of accessibility training. When we first start at the college, we are required to take an accessibility training session. I started nearly 4 years ago. I haven't had much since then. So it's kind of like, I pick up things when I can, but that's part of my job now is I have to understand more, learn more, get the information so that we have it for our patrons. So it's kind of like ongoing learning. So I'm really happy to be here. And I feel like I've taught myself so much when I've been preparing for this webinar. So hope that you guys will find it helpful as well. Thank you.
Thanks, both of y'all. So the important part of this is we're not capital E experts, but we do have a passion for library services and instruction, and accessibility is a part of that, a skill that we've cultivated and are continuing to work on, and we want to share with you all today. And so the first question that I have that will kind of frame the session itself is, why is accessibility important? It's something that you might feel like you need to convey to your colleagues, to management potentially, to new hires at your institution. But it's a question that I find we keep coming back to when we learn about accessibility. If you need to make an argument as to why accessibility matters, here are some of the three that are the most powerful. So depending on the point of view of your institution, your stakeholders, whether that may be patrons or community members, you may choose one or a combination of these arguments. But as long as library services and the website are accessible, it doesn't really matter what the motivation is. The first argument is the human-centered one, which is Accessible websites improve the lives of people with disabilities. They allow them to join 2023 and perform basic functions and activities. And so that's a really important part of librarianship and the community building that we do. The second argument is the business-centered one, which I feel like I see in so many strategic plans in libraries, which is have your library reach a wider audience. When you make things accessible online on your website and you're continually trying to improve it with people with disabilities in mind, you're able to bring people into the library who may not otherwise be able to participate. And so that is a really key part of kind of reaching all users and expanding your community that you're serving. The last argument is the legal-centered public relations argument. And I'm sure it's one that you're familiar with, and that is avoiding getting sued or any sort of legal complaint. Now, this argument is one where I'm not a disability law expert at all, but I think that it is something to keep in mind as the ADA and other legal regulations are being updated. It's really important for government websites, which can include library websites and university websites, to continue to remain accessible and ensure that in their courses, in their services, things like that. The focus of our webinar today will be on web accessibility, which means making online content available to and usable by everyone, including and especially people with disabilities. All right. So here are our areas of focus today. Some of this might be familiar to you, but we figure an overview doesn't hurt. We'll then do an analysis of what we control as library workers. There's so much that we create with our patrons in mind, whether it's libguides or videos or social media posts or documents. Designing these materials in an accessible way is a key part of that. The last thing that we'll cover will be freely available tools that you can use. And after that, we'll go into those breakout rooms to do a deep dive on certain skills. It's up to you which breakout room you choose as well. All right, we're kicking things off with the accessibility standards. So the standards are a mix of guidelines and legal regulations. We'll cover how these have come to govern web accessibility, and there's no shortage of documentation for these standards, a lot of which we've tried to link to in the Google Doc that I sent out earlier today. All right, so here are the big three: ADA, Section 508, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, last year, guidance was published on how state and local governments and businesses can make sure that their websites are accessible to people with disabilities. The ADA has historically been used to enforce physical accessibility of spaces. In their updated guidance, they provide the comparison that an inaccessible website is like a building without curb cuts or wheelchair ramps. If patrons cannot get access to public information, they're essentially getting shut out in the same way. The ADA especially prioritizes actions that are taken on a government website. So for our public libraries, that can include signing up for a library card. And so forms on a website are a really key part of web accessibility. We've included some documentation on accessible forms and certain tools that you can use in web development to create them. The next thing is Section 508. So this is probably the most straightforward piece of accessibility legislation in the country. It holds all federal agencies and those receiving federal funding accountable to making their information and communications technology, or ICT, accessible to people with disabilities. ICT means things like email, websites, documents, videos, social media, any way that agencies and those receiving federal funding communicate with the public. This is what provides more of the legal teeth for web accessibility. And this was set into law in 1998 with the advent of the internet and email communication. 508 is often confused with 501, Section 501, which covers protections for people with disabilities when applying for a job. And that's going to be covered in our webinar on February 22nd. So we're not really going to get to that today. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, were developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the main standards organization for the internet. These were first published in 1999. They're updated constantly, but they're an essential reference, and they offer these levels of accessibility compliance, A, AA, and AAA. And as of 2018, library websites are required to meet AA. In our resource list, we've included some checklists of what needs to be accessible at each level that are really easy to read and work through. And what governs these guidelines is this set of guiding principles, the acronym POUR. So the first thing is accessible websites need to be perceivable. So that means that content must be able to be consumable by screen readers and other assistive technologies. Websites and apps that require just sight or hearing won't pass the test of perceivability. And about 10 years ago, there were a lot of websites that did a lot of gorgeous video-based and animation graphics that ultimately weren't really that accessible. And so that's something to keep in mind is when you're creating things with videos, with animation, having things that a screen reader can use and read, or somebody can use their iOS accessibility features, their voiceover to read is really important. Operable basically means that people with disabilities need to be able to operate websites and applications with a variety of tools, such as keyboard shortcuts. There needs to be a basic structure in place for them to do that. And that's where things like using headings is really important. We'll go into that in more detail as well later. Understandable. So understandable websites use clear, concise language that is easy to comprehend. We've included a resource for the principles of plain language. There also just needs to be a consistent format for web pages, website navigation, and online forms. And that's where things like sitemaps and information architecture of a website are really important. And the last thing is robust. So the content on web pages needs to be able to be used and interpreted by a variety of users, but also it should just be able to work on any technology, mobile, desktop, and any browser, Firefox, Google Chrome. When there are differences in how technology is working across those things, that's a problem. And so robust is really just following good web development standards. All right. So we have a quick poll that I'll launch now. So I want to ask you all, has your library or institution required any training on accessibility? And if they have, if you want to share in the chat what kind of training that was, that would be excellent. All right, we've got about 3/4 of our audience who've submitted the poll. I'll share that out now. Okay, so 7 people say yes, their library or institution has required training on accessibility, but most have said no. And Jenny has clarified in the chat, it's not required, but it is offered. Awesome, and thanks for sharing in the chat. So ways to find accessibility features on public PCs, recently developed in-house training on a county level, did a certificate in digital accessibility. Okay, great. That was something we were curious about because I feel like libraries have kind of been tasked with, all right, tackle this new obstacle. What does that mean for us? And so, oh, Amy, that's great to hear that plain language has been a big push for Hennepin County. It's just also a best practice in general when you're working with patrons that might be non-native English speakers. And so there's some more resources on plain language that we've linked to in our Google Doc. And then Christina sharing required orientation video for all staff, optional trainings for full community. Gotcha. All right, and with this, I'll hand it over to AlTonya, who will cover what we control.
All right, thank you, Devon. So I'm talking about what we control, but I just want to take a second and talk with you guys about how I actually got here involved in this webinar. I talked earlier about Winston-Salem State having a requirement when you first start to have some kind of accessibility training. And I also said, I've been here about 4 years. And we don't really, I've really not done anything really intense since then. And it occurred to me, I got kind of a wake-up call a few weeks ago. It occurred to me how much had fallen off my radar in terms of accessibility. And so I think I'm talking about strategies. One thing is to be aware and to stay aware. You never know when you're going to get a phone call from a patron who has a question about what your library offers. And that is exactly what happened in my situation a few weeks ago. Actually, at the beginning of the semester, we had a student to call in and talk with someone in our circulation department and ask, what kind of accessibility products do you have, offers, options for students? And I didn't get a chance to talk with the student, but one of my coworkers did up in circulation, and she really didn't have a whole lot to share with the student. And by the time I got the call, actually, I never got the call because it either dropped or the student hung up. And so that was really frustrating to me. And it just reiterated the fact that I've let a lot of things fall off my radar in terms of accessibility, and I needed to fix that. So fast forward a couple of weeks later, I'm in a CTAC training advisory committee meeting with Devon, and she's saying, oh, we're going to be doing this accessibility webinar, and we'd really like for someone to help us, take part in it. And I said, this is a perfect time for me to start really ramping up and honing my skills, building my skills back up when it comes to accessibility and what we have to offer here at CGO Kelly. And so as the slide says, it's about what we control, but also who controls it, who's in charge of accessibility for your websites, your LibGuides, your videos, whatever is going out and being presented for your patrons. Your patrons, they live this is their life. It's not something that they can afford to have fall off their radar. And likewise, we can't afford for that to happen either. So in talking about what we control and who controls it, we actually are going to start things off with a question in the chat. Who manages your library website? And I'm not asking for names or any kind of vital information. If it's your director, you can put that in the chat, your supervisor, your IT folks. It may also be that you don't know. Put that in there. If you have no idea who handles your accessibility for your website, you can say that. If you've never thought about it, say that. I see a lot of people saying me, the department chair. A lot of people are just handling it themselves. And so that may definitely very well be the case. And it just depends on what kind of library. Luckily, you've got a team of great staff, librarians, and university. Exactly. So a lot of times, if you do know who is handling your accessibility, how often do you talk to them? If it's not you, how often are you talking to them about what goes into that? How often are you speaking with this person about what you have to offer for your visually impaired patrons? I see a lot of reference folks. Yeah, the reference folks are generally the ones that handle it. And I think I might be doing your job, Devon, by reading the
No, you're good. I think it's also good when folks say communications team or library admin or university committee to do an estimate of the actual number of people who are in charge of the library website in some way. If it's getting into more than 10 people, it might be good to kind of ask around to that group or reach out to your campus's accessibility office and say, hey, let's do a refresher training, because the guidelines will always change. They're not going to be static, and it's important for us to kind of keep on top of that. It's also, if your library staff has had a big turnover in the last few years and there are new hires. I know one person mentioned a required video, but having that sort of refresher is always good if there's a changing staff at your library.
Right. At my library, it's a combination of people. Our e-resources librarian is also our person that handles a lot about our website needs, but we also have our IT department and our marketing department that handles marketing for the entire campus. And so their instructions or their directives about accessibility often trickle down and are followed by our marketing person that's in the library. So next, how many people create digital content for your library? So again, I just mentioned a marketing person. This can be anyone who is in charge of creating videos, LibGuides, documents, social media. If you're having a program and you need a flyer created, who's doing that? Social media. When I was in public library, we had one person that did all of our flyers, but then she sent those flyers on to our marketing person who made sure that everything was in place, that it was accessible, that the color contrasts were right and all of that. Now that I'm in academic library, I have one marketing person and she pretty much makes all the decisions in terms of our content for social media and things of that nature. But she also takes her instruction from our marketing department. So I see somebody saying 5 of us. Some people have very small staffs, and some people have lots of people who feed into this. So while you're answering, I wanted to just say a couple of things about LibGuides and documents. If you're in public library, I don't know if you're handling LibGuides as much as you might be other kinds of documents, but accessibility plays regardless of what you're handling. And we all need to be aware of that. If you're not one of the people who's creating documents, digital content for your library, you still need to know about it. It's still important to be aware of accessibility and what that means for your patrons. So take it from me. You don't want to be the one to get that phone call and not be able to answer that patron's question. So this next slide basically goes over a few of the things that we're going to be talking about in our breakout rooms. They will be covered in each of the rooms, but in different ways. I'll be covering a couple of things that I'm going to point out on this slide, but one thing I want you to take from this, a lot of these slides, this session will be made available to you. If accessibility topics have fallen off your radar, or you just haven't had a time to focus in on them, take a look at this. Remember these things. These are the kinds of things that patrons will inevitably, students will inevitably contact you about and ask you, what is your library? How can your library help me in terms of this? In my breakout room, I plan to talk a little bit more about using alt text for images. creating captions for videos, and looking at our visual editor in LibGuides. So I know Devon and Eva will be talking about a lot of these headings as well, but when it comes to using alt text, creating captions in LibGuides, I've got just a couple more slides I want to show you. I am going to be focusing a little bit in detail, not doing a serious deep dive. Again, I am not an expert, but one of the exercises that I'm going to do in my breakout room is just talking about alt text, determining which items, images that need alt text and which ones don't. Sometimes, depending on how your image is produced, you may not need alt text. And so I'm going to just go through an exercise and kind of break some things down, and also share some information on how you can determine tips and tricks for determining whether your image is great on its own or whether it needs more information. Another slide that I want to show next will also discuss our visual editor in our LibGuides. And so I am going to actually go out into my LibGuides, and I'm going to talk about how the visual editor behaves, just a few things that I'd like for people to take away from that and generate a conversation. So just giving you guys a little sneak peek about what's going to be there, and hope that you will join me. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my to Eva, and she will carry on from there.
AlTonya, do you want to cover this example here on this slide, or what are we thinking?
I was going to cover it during my breakout room, but okay, I can go ahead and talk a little bit more about it. Basically, with these images, you're looking at them and you're determining whether or not they're fine. On their own, you may think, yeah, this is great. This is telling me a lot that I need to know. But if you look at this first image, the image of Wade Davis, and if you can read that copy is a little bit faded, but it's saying it's a field photo of Wade Davis, who's an anthropologist. This first example really doesn't need anything extra. It's basically telling everyone what it is, and that's what you want. You want a screen reader to be able to go across and be able to tell that user exactly what it is without there being any confusion. We want our users to be able to comprehend everything, whether if they're visually impaired, we don't want there to be any barriers to them fully accessing our website. The second image, it would require more, it would require alt text, because it's really not telling the user what it is. It's giving information that this is anthropologist and author Wade Davis, but it's not really saying that it's a photo. So we need for the alt text to display that. We need some kind of information that gives our user more information as far as what they're looking at. And in the third example of the fake news, the quote, the meme, this is kind of one that's, it's not entirely wrong, but it's not correct entirely either. With this image, basically what we need for our user to know is not to believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. That piece right there is perfect for our alt text. But what we are given under the image itself is this telling us that this fake quote meme attributed to Abraham Lincoln highlights why you shouldn't always believe everything you read. So that's not really giving the user enough information to fully comprehend what they're looking at. And so when I go out into my breakout room, I'll tell you a little bit more about, how you can set these things up and what you need to look for when you're trying to make those distinctions about whether or not you want to provide more content. And then again, my visual editor in LibGuides, I'll take you guys out there. If you have worked in LibGuides and you've created a lot of material, that's great. I've inherited a lot of LibGuides. And a lot of my LibGuides are not accessible. And so I'm showing you things that you want to look at, just those glaring things that you can fix. When I started several years ago, I just saw a lot of things that didn't pass muster. And so I'm going to go out and just show you a few things to pay attention to. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eva.
All right, so in this portion of the webinar, I will be talking about some free tools that are available to help you ensure that your users can understand, navigate, and interact with your library's digital presence. But before we get talking about the tools, I do want to do a quick poll. Have you used a web accessibility testing tool on your library's website? So I think there's going to be a yes or no question. And then hopefully.
Yeah, one second. Let me see why it should be launched. Okay. What's going on here? Oh, it was still sharing. They change what this looks like every time. There we go. Oh, okay, so we have some recommendations. Cobliss for colorblind simulator, Wave web tool. I believe our library director did when he built the site. I'm sure Webmaster has. Okay. Wave for WebM. All right, and then I'll share out the results.
All right, so about, I don't know, a little less than half have and a little more than half says no. So I'm going to be talking about a few of our free tools for website checkers in the next slide. So the first set of tools I want to talk about are those website checkers. Website checkers are used to identify accessibility issues through scanning your website's code. So many of the free checkers will have you kind of manually enter your website's URL, and then you will receive feedback. So anything from a detailed audit, some explanations, some even have a score based on like the legal side that Devon was talking about, a breakdown of issues based on severity, etc. So many of these tools also attempt to provide guidance on how to fix the issues. I say attempt to because many of these tools present like overwhelming amounts of information, and if you're not used to the terms and how to actually fix the code, the information presented might not be as helpful. Some examples of free website accessibility checkers are Wave, which I see some of you have mentioned that in the chat. There's also accessibility checker. I think it's accessibilitychecker.org, and then access scan. They're all linked there. And those are the ones that I'm going to be talking about in the breakout room that I'm going to be hosting. So if you're interested in kind of seeing some examples of, I'm going to be using my LibGuides page as an example of running through Wave and Accessibility Checker and Access Scan and just talking about some of the pros and cons that come along with that. And hopefully getting some, some feedback from you all and some tips and whatever that you guys want to share with me as well. I'd be happy to listen to those for sure. But those are the website checkers. So the second set of tools that we are going to talk about are screen readers. So very simply, this technology reads out loud what is on the screen. And as Devon mentioned earlier, that heading structure is very important for the screen reader to actually understand what comes first and second and third and so on. Screen readers also work best when web pages have descriptive tags about the content in their markup, which provides like additional information that goes beyond just how they would look on the screen. or on the page. When your website does not have appropriate descriptive tags or has accessibility oversights, a visitor using that screen reader might miss some of your content. So we talked about a little bit about how your users not going to be gaining that information that you want them to. Or they might just not use your website at all because it's not usable for them. So we can use screen readers as library professionals to kind of gain hands-on experience with obstacles users may come across using our websites. So some examples of an obstacle may be when a user rolls over the image, as AlTonya was talking about, and there might be zero or insufficient alternative text to describe the image. Some other obstacles may be like an inability to use the keyboard to navigate a website. As Devon was talking about earlier, a lot of people may need to use the keyboard only to be able to access the website. So that may be an issue there, or a lack of visual cues, say if a link requires a description. So some examples of free screen readers are Windows Narrator. This is a built-in app for both Windows 10 and 11. And NVDA. So those are both linked there on the screen. If you'd like to kind of go about looking at those on your own time. We will not be talking about those in the breakout room.
We've also linked to Apple's iOS accessibility tools. That's another one too.
Yeah.
Did I jump ahead a little?
Well, it's right here, but it is a part of that one. I probably should have linked it both times. Yeah, so these are just a few more accessibility tools, and I'm not going to cover these as much. The first two, the Inspector and Lighthouse. So these are developer tools that you can use using the F12 button. And in the breakout room, I'll show you how that's used to kind of see if there is an alt text and if that alt text is insufficient. So the F12, you can use it in both Chrome and Firefox. And so the Inspector is for Firefox and the Lighthouse is for Chrome. They also have, at least the Lighthouse has a tool for improving your web pages. So they perform accessibility audits for that, and I can show you that as well. So you can use the tools to access your page's accessibility tree, allowing you to see what's missing or needs attention. In addition, Lighthouse offers an accessibility audit, which we just talked about. And let's see. So VoiceOver, which Devon just mentioned, is another screen reader that's available for Apple products. The cool thing about VoiceOver is that it's available in more than 60 languages and has different voices for you to choose from. And we mentioned, or some people have mentioned, the colorblind web filters. There's one linked here. It may not be the one that you're used to, but it's another tool to kind of gain hands-on experience and how your users with colorblind issues may see your content. And so like some other tools, you supply your URL and it would generate like a side-by-side kind of comparison. And there is a link that talks about keyboard or tab navigation, which we mentioned a few times. This link is to an article supplied by Waugh. It sounds like some of you are familiar with that. The article talks about how users with motor disabilities rely on keyboard to navigate websites. So it's important to kind of ensure that your content can be accessed with the keyboard alone. The article talks about the many potential problems that can get in the way of the keyboard navigation. So that's an interesting kind of article for you to cover. And lastly, on this page is a link to accessibility evaluations and vendor responses for various library vendors. So that's just another link to kind of get an idea about some of the third-party sources that we use and their accessibility responses.
With that final link, I think also it's helpful for folks, make friends with your e-resources department. I know that in my experience with accessibility testing, if you see certain things when you're testing with users with disabilities, like link resolvers and certain things, relaying that information to them and then having them contact the vendor, they're a really crucial advocate in the process. We have one question about accessibility about Microsoft Narrator. So would the Microsoft Narrator be automatically part of the software that if we have Windows 10 on our public PCs?
I would suspect, but I don't know that question without looking at it. I think I would say probably, just off the top of my head. So my last slide here is just to sum up why we do accessibility checking in the first place. We do all of this work of checking our web pages so we can make our content usable to as many people as possible. Web accessibility can increase your user base, as we talked about earlier, and most importantly, by making your content accessible, users can access the content they need to achieve their goals. So that's kind of just a sum up slide for all of us.
All right, so we're going to stop for questions before we go into the breakout rooms. One thing that we talked about was online forms. We didn't get into a lot of the details surrounding that, but using things like HTML tags and ARIA labels are something to keep in mind. I'll look at our document that we've shared out beforehand and see what are some good tools for accessible forms, but that's something also that's a big part of the web presence of the library. And Jenny is sharing UserWay has a free widget that you can add to your web page as an accessibility menu. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jenny. All right, well, if there are no questions, we have 3 breakout rooms that will be going on. So we've kind of alluded to those and referenced them a couple times. Breakout room 1 is accessible documents. I'll be walking through how to create an accessible document in Word and in Adobe. The second breakout room, which will be led by Eva, is using automated website checkers. And then the third is led by AlTonya, which will be making courses and online instructional materials accessible. And AlTonya, as she shared, will be covering more on captioning, LMSs, LibGuides, things like that. So take a minute to look at these offerings and I'll set up the breakout rooms now. All right, so we have the 3 different breakout rooms. Feel free to join. I will be joining breakout room 1. The breakout rooms won't be recorded, so we won't be able to simultaneously record all 3. But we will share any of the links and slides and resources that we use in those. And feel free to send me a chat or unmute yourself if you're struggling to join a breakout room.